So that's perfect. I think Faisal just built the ground perfectly for the argument I'm going to lay down here. And it's going to sound fairly radical, but the SDGs in the way they're designed today are unachievable. Within capitalism, outside of capitalism, with any kind of system, economic system you want, you will not be able to achieve all the SDGs together. So why is that? Because there's a contradiction between some of the goals. And the one I'm going to focus on is mainly SDG 8 and the fact that it focuses on economic growth. And just before, because one of the weaknesses of the SDGs when we think of the 17 goals is that it's a bit like a laundry list, you know, we have all of them like this, but it's really rather a hierarchy. And I'm gonna, there's this figure from the Stockholm Resilience Center made by my colleague that they call the wedding cake, you know, where they're putting 4 SDGs linked to the environment, you know, climate action, life in the water, life on land, clean water. They put this at the base. And then you have the social and societal SDGs. And then you have the economic SDGs. So if you fail to achieve the environmental SDGs, you will fail to achieve all the rest. That's for sure. And, you know, if you go on the SDG dashboard index website to check the advancement of the SDGs, and there's been the SDG report published recently, you will see that these 4 environmental SDGs are doing terrible. Climate action, life in the water, I mean, it's a real disaster. You look at the map, it's red everywhere. So these, we've not done any progress, and the situation is actually deteriorating on many aspects. So why is that? The claim I've been trying to show through my research is because, and I think Faisal have been introducing this aspect as well, as we have in high-income country been creating an extractive engine. So what we measure as GDP growth in the North and what we're trying desperately to decouple from environmental degradation is actually dependent on the extraction of many resources from the global South and the emissions of many pollutions also with impact in the global South. So we remember one of the target of SDG 8, I think I've got it here. Target number 4, endeavor to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. So decoupling is the idea we can keep having a rising GDP, but disconnected from the use of resources and the impact on the environment. That's the idea of green growth that we know have on many international organizations and many governments. Fact is, scientifically, this decoupling, we don't see it. And I say this very seriously. There's been the first review of literature taking into account every single empirical study of decoupling since the concept exists in the 90s. It's 835 studies, almost 1,200 analysis. And what does it say? It says, well, most of the places in the world have not managed to decouple. And the one that have, they've managed relative amount of decoupling, so relatively more efficient, but total impact is still rising. Most of the time, that's only temporary for a couple of impacts, maybe for carbon, maybe for water pollution, but never for all impact together. And even in the very few countries in the world that have managed to achieve a few years of absolute decoupling, maybe when they undergone an energy transition from one energy source to another. Even these countries reduce their emission by almost nothing, a few percent. You know, top decouplers, we're talking 1-2% max. Compare this to the type of decrease we need to match the Paris Agreement, and we need double-digit emission reduction. Here, I'm only talking about carbon, but that's even worse for biodiversity, for the material footprint, for water pollution, for the usage of land, all the type of stuff that are not being discussed in green growth, because the green growth discussion is a bit obsessed about carbon. Even that carbon, we're not managing at all to invert the trend. So now, I mean, the SDGs were 2015, we're 6 years after. I think it's time to update the scientific knowledge and to admit that we're not going to manage to decouple GDP growth from environmental pressures. That's just extremely unlikely and absolutely unlikely in the very decade where most of these actions need to be done. So now that's my first opening statement. It doesn't even matter. We're not talking about capitalism here. Even if you had, global communism or the best planning or eco-socialism, still, if you have a growing economy measured as rising GDP, you will have growing environmental degradations. So far, that's what's been happening in the histories of human economies. But now let me switch to a second argument to show that capitalism is a particularly bad system to meet the SDGs. It's one system that is, let's say, one of the worst to achieve that goal, which is, we can call it degrowth, which is to, let's say, have this big transition from the goal of decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation to the goal of decoupling human well-being from environmental degradation. This is not rhetoric. This is one of the most important shifts in the history of economics, to admit that the definition of prosperity, that economic growth can actually sometimes be counterproductive to the achievement of human well-being. Here, of course, it's very easy to show that that happens through environmental degradation. So the benefits of economic growth, which are appropriated by those that are already rich. We know this also empirically. Economic growth is a very poor strategy to reduce poverty. And in the SDG as well, there is no talk of redistribution. It's like when you look at SDG 10 on inequality, the target points like the poor people just need to be growing faster than the rich people, and somehow that's going to even it out. I mean, ask any 5 years old, what's the solution to poverty? And I think you'll get a better answer than this one, which is precisely, take from the rich, give to the poor. So the SDG is also a bit too vague about this. But now let me point to why capitalism, I think, is partly unfit to the task. And here, we're not going to get caught in defining what capitalism is about, but let me give you a few features, at least to make sure, we're not too abstract. When I'm thinking of capitalism, I'm relying on the predominance of a few institutions, the private concentration of means of production, and the private ownership of whatever is produced in these companies. The predominance of wage labor, the pursuit of profits, and having markets as a main mean of allocation. So that's kind of the definition of capitalism. So the question is capitalism adapted to fill the SDGs? Is capitalism a good system in a time of social ecological emergency? 1 year ago, you would have asked me this question that would have been very theoretical, but there's been the pandemic. So now let's look empirically, what did we do during the pandemic in a situation of social ecological emergency? Did we just say like capitalism is going to solve it? Let's just wait for the market to just produce a vaccine and distribute it. So far, we've been doing part of this, and we can see on the distribution of vaccine, a shocking situation. If you look at a map of vaccine distribution, you will see that most of them are in high-income countries that have been hoarding them. It reminds me, of those pictures you see when taken with satellite during the night, and you see points of lights that also in the global north that we use to show like patterns of unequal exchange of, the global north extracting energy and materials from the global south. Same thing, Faisal was talking about financial flows. Now we have a new flow to keep track of, the flow of vaccine. Doses being sucked up in the north, patent being retained in the north. High-income countries only contain 19% of world population, and yet they've bought 54% of all vaccine doses available up to now. So here we really show what happens when you let capitalism just handle a social problem. It does it in a very unfair manner. But now let's look at what did individual country do. Individual country acted, I think, against the basic rules of capitalism with price controls on hydroalcoholic gel, for example, in France, on specific quotas, on not, expecting us to decouple hugs from virus spreadings through technological development, but through, precautionary principle, geste barrière, preventing, decreasing physical interaction. In the meantime, for us to find a vaccine, in the meantime, for us to better organize, following the principle of precaution. So now I'm thinking, okay, we've done this for the pandemic, and now we're resorting to discussing climate change, and we're using a complete different mentality. Why is that? I think it's only because the pandemic strikes us as, you know, an immediate fear, and climate change and, you know, biodiversity loss and the death of oceans and, you know, irreversible land change leading to, you know, a loss of fertility, all of these stuff do not seem that threatening, because also the rich people have the capacity to protect themselves against it. So to conclude, I think here we need to use a word, and that word is planning. So my answer is, we need not only, of course, to ditch capitalism as a system. I think this is why I like to research post-capitalism. I think so now the pandemic and the failure of the SDGs has shown that we need to try something different. We know this. Whatever that different is, we don't quite yet know, and there are many different options, but we know it needs to be something different. That's the first point. And the second point is that whatever that system is, it cannot be a system centered around the pursuit of economic growth. Let it be socialism, communism, eco-anarchism, you know, a new form of capitalism, whatever you have. Again, that's like a biophysical constraint. If it's growing, it's going to be a problem. Here, it's not only theoretical, it's going to be a problem because it's going to prevent us from meeting the SDGs. So it's going to be a poverty, a gender equality, a democracy problem. I'll start with this and